We don't like to be reminded that we don't live forever. And we avoid talking about death, whether it's our own or that of our loved ones, because it's a painful reminder that one day we'll have to say goodbye. It's not an easy thing to talk openly about, which is part of the reason why today's message will come to us in 3 parts, with a little breathing space in between each one. The other reason that we talk about this in 3 parts this morning is because it's biblical. Jesus tried 3 different times that we know of to talk to his friends, to prepare them for his death. Because Jesus knew how disorienting his death would be for his disciples, for those closest to him. So he tried again and again and again to engage them in a conversation about what was going to happen. And each time they reacted in ways that feel very familiar to us, as you'll see. By trying to talk openly to his friends about what was about to happen, Jesus shows us how talking about death is not easy. But it is loving. It's a reminder that the loving thing is not always the easiest thing to do. Yet when the time comes to say goodbye, having had these hard conversations ahead of time frees those who are grieving from the stress of worrying if they are doing what their loved one would have wanted. Having these hard conversations is an act of love for those who are dying to make their wishes known, just as it's an act of love for those left behind to care for their loved ones in the ways that they wish. It's not easy, but speaking openly of death is rooted in love. God's love for us and our love for each other. For we may not know when or how death will come for us, but at some point we know that all of our breath, all that we are, will return to God. And that's what Ash Wednesday and Lent is all about. Like I said, if we can't be gloomy now, when can we be? Lent reminds us that we are dust, and to dust we shall return. But at its heart, it's a powerful call to fill all of that in-between time with as much love as we can. So this morning, we reflect on love in 3 parts as we consider how love calls us to prepare, plan, and provide for our loved ones before we take our rest in glory. Part 1. The first time that Jesus tried to talk to his friends about his death, Peter didn't want to hear about it. He took Jesus aside and tried to get him to stop. Don't say that, Jesus. Stop thinking that way. Everything is going to be fine. You're going to be okay. These are the words that we utter to keep death at a distance, to deny the reality that life doesn't last forever. But it's there. We can feel it in our bodies. We carry our death with us. And when we acknowledge it, when we're honest about the limits of our human condition, we're moved to live more fully and to love more deeply. Long before Peter would deny Jesus down the road in Jerusalem, Peter tried to deny the possibility of Jesus' death, prompting Jesus to utter a harsh reprimand that we all know well. Get behind me, Satan. Jesus rebukes Peter because lurking just behind our denial of death is a desire for immortality, a temptation that can drive us to extreme measures, which is where this conversation can get tricky, right? Partly because we've cast accepting the reality of death as giving up. And nobody wants to ever give up. So we deny the reality of death because we're worried that by talking about it, by accepting it, it means we're giving up on life. We're worried that talking about death undermines our love for our life and the lives of our family members. But that is a false dichotomy. Because just as Jesus was honest with his loved ones, having an open and honest conversation about the reality of death is rooted in love. Finding the courage and the compassion to talk about death allows us to honor life and to preserve dignity to the end of life's journey. There are two really good resources out there that can help you think through these issues. Help you think through how you would like to be cared for and how to share your wishes with your loved ones. The first one is called simply the Conversation Project. It's a free worksheet that guides you through a series of questions to help you define what's most important to you, and it helps you prepare to have these hard conversations with your loved ones. The other is called 5 Wishes. It's another worksheet that addresses the various dimensions of care, from the personal and the spiritual to the medical and the legal. And if you would like copies of either of these resources, or even if you would like to sit down, I would love to work through them with you. This is who we are called to be. To hold each other in these places of vulnerability and uncertainty. Because we're called to love one another. To love one another as Christ has loved us. So I encourage you, beloved of God, to take heart. Just as love moved Jesus to prepare his disciples, may love move us to prepare each other. May it empower us to have these loving but hard conversations with those we love as we seek to honor life, preserve dignity, and love one another into eternity. Friend is our beacon. Though they failed to understand these words, they were afraid to question him. Fear is a powerful force in our lives. It has the potential to hijack and to override all of our other faculties if we're not careful. And as creatures who are very much aware of what it means to be alive, death is a scary thing. We view death as the antithesis of life rather than as an inevitable part of it. We avoid talking about it because it's hard for us, if not impossible, to imagine not being, as the theologian Paul Tillich would say. It's hard to talk about death because we're afraid to imagine the world without the ones that we love. We're afraid of saying goodbye and entering into the unknown. We're afraid that acknowledging the reality of death will rob us of life's joy. Fear often keeps us from asking these hard questions about life and death. When Jesus tries this second time to talk to his disciples about what was going to happen, fear kept them from asking him about the challenges ahead. Now, personally, I'm curious about which part of Jesus' teaching the disciples feared most. The part where Jesus said he was going to be put to death, or the part about rising again in 3 days. Either one would have raised a lot of questions in my mind. The disciples were too afraid to ask anything. Maybe because they just had too many questions, and they didn't know where to start. See, there's always a lot of questions when someone dies. But here, again, is an opportunity for us to love and care for our loved ones in their grief. Because some questions can be answered ahead of time, especially when those questions are about a funeral or memorial service plan. One of the most humbling and sacred parts of being a pastor or a minister is being with families in times of grief, sitting with them and holding them. And as I work with these families to plan funerals or memorial services, I ask questions. Did your mom have any favorite hymns? Was there a meaningful scripture to your dad? Who would you like to participate in the service? What picture would you like on the cover of the bulletin? And sometimes, if I'm lucky, a family brings me notes that their loved one has left about what they would like or not like at their service. Or sometimes they bring a bulletin from another funeral that was meaningful to their family member. I say I'm lucky because these are always great starting points for our conversation. But my hope and my prayer is that these moments become the norm rather than the exception. Because when I talk with families, I have a form that helps me work through all the necessary details. But there's no reason that I'm the only one that should have access to this form. It's available to you to fill out for your own wishes so your family is not left guessing about what your favorite hymns are or your favorite scriptures. And again, just like with the 5 wishes or the conversation project, I'm more than happy to sit down with you and to work through these details. That is the beauty of what it means to be together in this beloved community. Because no matter how old or young we are, love calls us to overcome our fear of saying goodbye. And having a plan to give to our loved ones is a gift. It's a gift of love. I'm happy to work with you on these plans. We can keep them on file here at the church, and you can have as many copies as you want to give to your family members. We're told that there is no fear in love, but that perfect love drives out fear. So may Christ's perfect love lead us to care for our loved ones as they grieve for us. One final time, Jesus tries one more time to outline what is going to happen. And this time it's in much more detail. The shadow of death looms even larger on the horizon as they go up towards Jerusalem. See, Jesus' unorthodox teaching and his actions haven't gone unnoticed by the powers that be in Jerusalem. And by this time, it's pretty clear what Jesus has been trying to tell them. At least the dying part. The rising again in 3 days will still take them a little while to wrap their head around. But after having known him for years, having traveled with him, having studied under him, two of Jesus' very first disciples recognized that their teacher's legacy would endure beyond the brutality of his death. So they approach him, and they ask to be part of that legacy. Grant us to sit next to you when you come into your glory. Beloved community, we are all the products of the saints and the sinners that have gone before us, and we have the potential to leave a legacy for those who will come after us. Just as preparing and planning for our loved ones were acts of love, so too is leaving a legacy. Because, as the old adage says, you can't take it with you. Our bodies will pass away, because that's the nature of bodies. But our spirits were made to live on. And we continue to live on in the memories of those we loved and who loved us. But we can also live on in the legacies that we leave. Legacies that we leave about the things that we were passionate about in life. Our earthly estates remain after our spirits return to God, but they can help support causes that were close to our hearts during our lives. But like with our last wishes and our funerals, it helps to make those things clear to our family and friends. We can provide ongoing support for schools and churches and other organizations by designating a portion of our estate to those causes. You heard just a little while ago in our annual meeting how we have memorial funds and estate gifts that have contributed to our endowment that help the work of this church continue. In one of his very first teachings, Jesus encourages people to store up for themselves treasures in heaven. For where your treasure is, he says, there also is your heart. It's in that same spirit that we recognize the legacies we leave behind, the legacies and the treasures that we leave behind reveal where our hearts are. So, dearly beloved, I know these are not easy tasks. This is heavy. But that's why we are together. It is an act of love that we come together to help bear one another's burdens. And having these conversations about preparing and planning and providing for our loved ones before we die is never easy. But we aren't called to live an easy life. We're called to live a life full of love. To love each other deeply, that we might live more fully. Right after Jesus rebukes Peter with that infamous "Get behind me, Satan" we heard earlier, he turned to the crowd and he went on to say, "If anyone were to follow me, let them deny themselves and take up their cross." Out of our love for each other, may we follow Christ's example, taking up our cross, helping each other to bear that burden. May we not be afraid to love one another with all that we have. and all that we leave behind. Beloved of God, it is hard, but we are in this together. Amen.